She was the voice that defined a generation, the girl who sang over the rainbow and made millions believe in magic. But behind the ruby slippers and that radiant smile lay a darkness so profound that even today, decades after her tragic death, the truth still breaks our hearts. Judy Garland's story isn't just one of stardom, it's a cautionary tale of how Hollywood's golden age devoured its brightest stars. What really happened to America's sweetheart? Will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the price of fame. In the dusty streets of Grand Rapids, Minnesota, a little girl with an extraordinary voice was about to change the world and lose herself in the process. Born on June 10, 1922, Frances Ethelgum had no idea that her talent would become both her greatest gift and her most devastating curse. Her mother, Ethel, was a failed vaudevillian who saw in her youngest daughter everything she had never been able to achieve. Little did the world know, this was where the tragedy truly began. Ethelgum wasn't just a stage mother, she was a woman consumed by her own broken dreams, willing to sacrifice her child's innocence on the altar of stardom. At just 2.5 years old, Frances was pushed onto stages across the Midwest, her tiny voice carrying melodies that would make grown men weep. But behind those bright footlights, a childhood was slowly disappearing. The Gum sisters, Frances and her 2 older siblings, became a traveling act, performing in vaudeville theaters and movie houses, while other children played with dolls and rode bicycles. Frances learned the harsh realities of show business. She discovered that applause could fill the emptiness in her chest, that the stage was the only place where she felt truly loved. It was a dangerous lesson that would haunt her for the rest of her life. By the time she was 10, Frances had already experienced more rejection and heartbreak than most adults. The family moved to California, chasing the Hollywood dream that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Her father, Frank, struggled with his own demons, finding solace in relationships that would eventually tear the family apart. Young Frances watched her parents' marriage crumble, learning that love was conditional, that security was an illusion. The transformation from Frances Gum to Judy Garland began at a talent showcase in 1934, when the young performer forgot the words to "Zing went the strings of my heart." She improvised with such raw emotion that the audience was spellbound. It was in that moment of vulnerability and authenticity that a star was born, but also when the real Frances began to disappear forever. The entertainment industry had found its next victim, disguised as opportunity. The phone call that changed everything came in 1935. MGM, the most powerful studio in Hollywood, wanted to sign 13-year-old Judy Garland to a contract. For most families, this would have been a dream come true. For Judy, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last her entire life. What the world didn't understand then, and what many still don't grasp today, is that the Hollywood studio system wasn't just about making movies. It was about manufacturing dreams at the expense of human souls. Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, ran his studio like a feudal kingdom. His stars weren't artists, they were property, assets to be molded, controlled, and exploited. When Judy walked through those imposing studio gates for the first time, she entered a world where her every move would be monitored, her every decision controlled by men who saw dollar signs. Instead of a vulnerable teenager, the studio immediately set about transforming Judy into their vision of perfection. They didn't like her teeth, so they fitted her with caps. They thought her nose was too prominent, so they used makeup and lighting tricks to change its appearance. Most devastatingly of all, they decided she was too heavy. In an industry obsessed with impossible beauty standards, Judy's natural figure was deemed unacceptable. The solution? Pills. Lots and lots of pills. Dr. Lee Siegel, the studio physician, became Judy's first dealer, though he wore a white coat instead of lurking in dark alleys. Amphetamines to keep her thin and energetic during grueling 16-hour filming days. Barbiturates to help her sleep when the uppers made rest impossible. It was a vicious cycle that began when Judy was barely 14 years old, and it was completely legal, even encouraged by the studio system. The real tragedy wasn't just the pills, though they were certainly devastating enough. It was the systematic destruction of Judy's sense of self. Every aspect of her identity was controlled by MGM. Where she went, whom she dated, what she said in interviews, even how she felt, all of it was managed by studio executives who cared more about their investment than the girl behind the talent. Judy learned that she was valuable only for what she could produce, never for who she was as a human being. The year 1939 should have been the happiest of Judy Garland's life. At 17, she was cast as Dorothy in what would become the most beloved film in Hollywood history. The Wizard of Oz would make her immortal, her rendition of Over the Rainbow becoming the song of the century. But behind the cameras, during those magical months of filming, Judy was slowly being destroyed by the very system that was making her famous. Little did audiences know that the girl singing about finding happiness somewhere over the rainbow was herself trapped in a hell of studio control and chemical dependence. The filming of The Wizard of Oz was notoriously difficult, with Judy required to work exhausting hours under blazing hot lights while wearing heavy costumes and makeup. The famous ruby slippers were actually uncomfortable and ill-fitting, causing her feet to bleed during the endless takes of her dancing scenes. But the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the psychological torture. MGM's executives were constantly critical of Judy's appearance and performance, never satisfied, always demanding more. They would call her fat and ugly to her face, then hand her pills to solve the problems they had created in her mind. The 17-year-old girl who sang with such hope about escaping to a better world was actually singing from the depths of her own prison. The famous recording session for Over the Rainbow tells a story that most fans never knew. Judy was struggling with the emotional weight of the song, pouring her own desperate longing for escape into every note. The studio executives initially wanted to cut the number from the film, calling it too sad and claiming it would slow down the story. They couldn't understand that the sadness they heard wasn't just acting, it was Judy's soul crying out for help. When the film premiered on August 25, 1939, Judy Garland became an overnight sensation. The world fell in love with Dorothy, with that pure voice and those expressive eyes that seemed to hold all the wonder and pain of youth. But success in Hollywood came with a terrible price. Judy was now MGM's most valuable property, which meant the control over her life became even more suffocating. She was 17 years old, addicted to pills, emotionally damaged, and trapped in golden handcuffs that would never let her go. In 1941, Judy thought she had found her escape in the form of David Rose, a sophisticated composer, 13 years her senior. Their romance seemed like something out of a movie script, the vulnerable young star finding solace in the arms of a talented, mature man who understood the music business. But like everything else in Judy's life, even love would become another mechanism of control, and heartbreak. Rose was already established in Hollywood, known for his lush orchestral arrangements and his work on popular radio shows. To 19-year-old Judy, he represented stability and artistic credibility, everything the plastic world of MGM was not. When they married in July 1941, it seemed like Judy had finally found someone who could protect her from the studio's manipulations. The truth, however, was far more complicated. MGM initially opposed the marriage, viewing it as a threat to their control over their most profitable star. They wanted Judy available for the romantic fantasies of her fans, not tied down to a real relationship with a real person. But when they realized they couldn't stop the wedding, they decided to exploit it instead, turning Judy's marriage into another publicity opportunity. Even her most intimate moments were being managed and monetized by the studio system. The marriage began to crumble, almost immediately under the pressure of Judy's career demands and her growing dependence on pills. Rose, who had fallen in love with the talented girl he met, found himself married to a studio asset whose every moment was scheduled and controlled. The spontaneous, passionate young woman he had courted was disappearing behind a haze of amphetamines and the relentless demands of fame. The most devastating blow came when Judy became pregnant in 1942. For a brief moment, she glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of life, one centered around family rather than career. But MGM had other plans. Louis B. Mayer and the studio executives pressured her to have an abortion, arguing that pregnancy would interfere with her filming schedule and damage her career. It was a decision that would haunt Judy for the rest of her life, representing the moment when she finally understood that she was not a person to these powerful men, she was merely a product to be maintained and exploited. By 1944, Judy Garland was at the peak of her popularity, but success had become a poison that was slowly killing her from the inside. Meet Me in St. Louis, directed by Vincente Minnelli, should have been another triumph. The film was beautiful, Judy's performance was luminous, and her rendition of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas became an instant classic. But behind the cameras, during the making of this wholesome family film, Judy was falling apart. The pills that had started as a studio-sanctioned solution to weight control had evolved into a full-blown addiction. Judy was now taking dozens of pills every day to get through the exhausting filming schedules, downers to sleep, and more uppers to wake up and start the cycle again. Her body was being systematically destroyed, but MGM's attitude was simple: as long as she could perform, the pills were just another cost of doing business. Vincente Minnelli, the film's director, became fascinated by Judy during the production. He saw in her a vulnerability and depth that went far beyond her public image as America's sweetheart. But his romantic interest in her was complicated by his awareness of her fragile mental state and her growing dependence on medication. The relationship that developed between them was both a genuine connection and another layer of complexity in Judy's already chaotic life. Little did the world know that during the filming of the movie's most joyful scenes, Judy was often barely holding herself together. The famous trolley sequence, where she sings the trolley song with such exuberance and joy, was filmed during a period when she was struggling with severe anxiety and depression. The contrast between her public image and her private reality was becoming impossible to maintain. The studio's response to Judy's obvious deterioration was to tighten their control rather than provide help. They assigned handlers to monitor her behavior, controlled her access to friends and family, and continued to supply her with the pills that were destroying her. MGM had created a monstrous system that fed on the destruction of its stars, and Judy was their most valuable victim. The girl who sang about happiness and home was trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. In June 1945, Judy married Vincente Minnelli in a ceremony that looked perfect from the outside. The bride was Hollywood's sweetheart. The groom was one of the industry's most talented directors, and their union seemed to promise both artistic collaboration and personal happiness. But like everything else in Judy's life, this marriage would become another source of both joy and devastating pain. Minnelli understood Judy's artistry in ways that few people ever had. He saw the depth of emotion that she brought to her performances, the way she could channel her own pain into characters that touched audiences' hearts. When they worked together on films like The Clock, their professional partnership created some of the most emotionally resonant moments in cinema. But understanding someone's art is not the same as being able to save them from their demons. The birth of their daughter, Liza Minnelli, in March 1946, should have been the happiest moment of Judy's life. For a brief time, it seemed like motherhood might provide the stability and purpose that had always eluded her. She threw herself into caring for Liza with the same intensity she brought to her performances, determined to be the kind of mother she had never had. But the studio system and her addiction had damaged her too deeply for maternal love alone to heal her wounds. MGM viewed Judy's pregnancy and new motherhood as inconveniences to be managed rather than celebrated. They pressured her to return to work as quickly as possible after Liza's birth, showing no consideration for her physical or emotional recovery. The studio's attitude toward its female stars was brutally clear. They were valuable only for what they could produce, and personal happiness was irrelevant if it interfered with profit. Minnelli found himself caught between his love for his wife and his inability to compete with the forces that were destroying her. He watched helplessly as the pills took their toll, as the studio's demands became increasingly unreasonable, and as the vibrant woman he had married slowly disappeared behind a mask of medication and misery. Their home, which should have been a sanctuary, became another stage where Judy had to perform the role of the happy wife and mother. Even as she was dying inside, the public first glimpsed the truth about Judy Garland's condition in 1947, though most fans refused to believe what they were seeing. During the filming of The Pirate, Judy's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She would arrive late to set, forget her lines, and sometimes become so disoriented that filming had to be suspended. The girl who had once been MGM's most reliable star was becoming their most expensive problem. Behind the studio's carefully crafted publicity machine, panic was setting in. Louis B. Mayer and his executives had invested too much in Judy to simply cut their losses. But her condition was becoming impossible to hide. They tried everything: new doctors, different medications, threats, bribes, and manipulation. Nothing worked. The addiction that they had created and enabled had taken on a life of its own. The breaking point came during a recording session that summer. Judy arrived at the studio so heavily medicated that she could barely stand, let alone sing. When she tried to perform, her voice, that magnificent instrument that had made her famous, cracked and faltered. The engineers and musicians watched in horror as America's songbird struggled to find the notes that had once come so naturally. It was a moment of devastating clarity. The system had broken its most precious asset. MGM's solution was to send Judy to a psychiatric hospital, officially for exhaustion, but really for what we would now recognize as a severe mental health crisis exacerbated by drug addiction. The public was told she needed rest, but the reality was far more serious. At 25 years old, Judy Garland was having a complete nervous breakdown, the inevitable result of years of abuse, exploitation, and chemical dependence. The months that followed were among the darkest of Judy's life. Isolated from her friends and family, struggling to overcome an addiction that had been forced upon her as a child, she faced a terrible truth. She didn't know who she was without the pills, without the performances, without the constant validation of applause. The girl named Frances Gumm had been buried so deeply under the creation called Judy Garland that she wasn't sure she could ever find her way back to herself. When Judy returned to MGM in 1948, both she and the studio were desperate to prove that she could reclaim her former glory. Easter Parade with Fred Astaire was meant to be her triumphant comeback, a return to the wholesome musical entertainment that had made her famous. On screen, she seemed vibrant and recovered, her voice as powerful as ever. But those who worked closely with her knew the truth. Judy was holding herself together through sheer force of will and a delicate balance of medications that could collapse at any moment. The film's success gave everyone false hope that the worst was over. But Judy's addiction hadn't been cured, had simply been managed more carefully. She was still taking pills to function, still struggling with the psychological damage of years of exploitation, still trapped in a system that valued her only for what she could produce. The underlying causes of her breakdown remained unaddressed, waiting to resurface with devastating consequences. Summerstock, filmed in 1950, would be Judy's last film for MGM, though no one knew it at the time. The production was a nightmare of delays, missed days, and increasingly erratic behavior. Judy would disappear for days at a time, leaving the entire production waiting while the studio sent people to find her. When she did appear, she was often in no condition to work, leading to tensions with her co-star Gene Kelly and the rest of the cast and crew. The most heartbreaking moment came during the filming of Get Happy, the number that would close the film. Judy had lost a significant amount of weight during production, and when she appeared on set to film the song, she looked gaunt and fragile, despite her energetic performance. The contrast between her physical deterioration and her determined professionalism was devastating to witness. She was literally dancing on the edge of collapse, giving everything she had left to a studio that had already taken too much. When MGM finally terminated Judy's contract in 1950, it felt like both a liberation and a death sentence. After 15 years, she was free from the studio that had controlled every aspect of her life since she was 13. But she was also cut loose, without the support system, however toxic it had been, that had structured her entire adult existence. At 28, Judy Garland had to learn how to be a person rather than just a performer, and she had no idea how to begin. In October 1951, Judy Garland walked onto the stage of the Palace Theater in New York for what many considered the most important performance of her career. Vaudeville was supposedly dead, killed by movies and radio. But Judy was determined to prove that live performance could still create magic. What the audience didn't know was that this comeback represented more than just a career move. It was Judy's desperate attempt to find the authentic connection with audiences that had been lost in the Hollywood machine. The weeks leading up to the Palace engagement were filled with anxiety and preparation. Judy knew that this performance would determine whether she still had a career or if she would join the long list of former stars who had been chewed up and spit out by the entertainment industry. She worked with Roger Edens, her longtime musical collaborator, to create a show that would showcase not just her voice but her personality, something that had been carefully controlled and managed. Throughout her MGM years, the opening night was electric in ways that movie sets could never be. When Judy walked out onto that stage, she was greeted by an audience that included many people who had grown up with her films, who had loved Dorothy and the characters she had played. But they were also seeing, perhaps for the first time, the real woman behind those performances. There was something raw and vulnerable in her performance that night, a honesty that came from having nothing left to lose. Over the Rainbow had never sounded more poignant than it did that night at the Palace. When Judy sang those familiar words about flying over the rainbow to a place where troubles melt like lemon drops, everyone in the theater understood that. She was singing about her own desperate hope for escape and healing. The song that had made her famous as a teenager now carried the weight of all her subsequent pain and disillusionment. The Palace engagement ran for 19 weeks, and was a critical and commercial success, proving that Judy could still command an audience and deliver performances of extraordinary emotional power. But success on the stage couldn't heal the deeper wounds that years of abuse and addiction had created. Even as she was being celebrated for her comeback, Judy was still struggling with the same demons that had nearly destroyed her at MGM. The applause was intoxicating, but it was also another form of drug, one that she would chase for the rest of her life. When Warner Brothers offered Judy the starring role in A Star is Born, it seemed like the perfect vehicle for her return to movies. The story of an alcoholic actor helping a young performer achieve fame while his own career crumbles was uncomfortably close to Judy's own experiences in Hollywood. But perhaps that's exactly why her performance in the film remains one of the most emotionally powerful in cinema history. Working with director George Cukor, Judy threw herself into the role of Esther Blodgett, Vicky Lester, with an intensity that worried everyone around her. She understood this character in ways that no other actress could, drawing on her own experiences of exploitation, addiction, and the crushing pressure of fame. When she sang The Man That Got Away in the film, she was channeling years of her own losses and disappointments into every note. The production of A Star is Born was troubled from the beginning, plagued by budget overruns, studio interference, and Judy's ongoing struggles with her health. She was determined to prove that she could carry a major film, but the pressure was immense. Every day on set was a battle against the medications she needed to function, the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her, and the knowledge that this might be her last chance at movie stardom. James Mason, who played her co-star and love interest, watched with growing concern as Judy pushed herself beyond her physical and emotional limits. He saw in her performance something that transcended mere acting. It was a woman laying her soul bare for the camera, using her art to process trauma that she had never been allowed to address in any other way. The vulnerability in her performance was both magnificent and heartbreaking. When A Star is Born was released in 1954, critics recognized immediately that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Judy's performance was nominated for an Academy Award, and many expected her to win, but the film had been heavily edited by the studio after its initial release, cutting much of Judy's best work in an attempt to reduce the running time. The movie that could have been Judy's masterpiece was compromised by the same kind of studio interference that had plagued her entire career. Sid Luft entered Judy's life in 1951 as both a lover and a manager, promising to help her navigate the entertainment industry on her own terms rather than as a studio asset. Their relationship was passionate and volatile, marked by genuine affection and devastating fights. Luft understood the business side of show business in ways that Judy never had, but he also became another person who benefited from her talent while struggling to protect her from its consequences. Their marriage in 1952 was Judy's third attempt at finding stability and happiness in her personal life. Luft was different from her previous husbands. He was a hustler and a promoter who saw Judy's potential, not just as an artist but as a business enterprise. He helped her get better deals, more creative control, and greater financial rewards. But he also encouraged her to take risks and push herself in ways that sometimes exacerbated her health problems. The birth of their daughter, Lorna, in 1952, and son Joey in 1955 brought Judy some of the happiest moments of her life. She adored her children and tried to give them the stable, loving childhood that she had never experienced. But her career demands and ongoing health issues made it difficult to be the kind of mother she wanted to be. The guilt over this failure would add another layer to the emotional burden she carried. Luft's management of Judy's career was both a blessing and a curse. He negotiated better contracts and helped her maintain some independence from the major studios, but he also pushed her to work constantly, knowing that their family's financial security depended on her ability to perform. The pressure to be the breadwinner, combined with her perfectionism and her addiction, created a vicious cycle that was impossible to break. As the years passed, Luft found himself in an impossible position. He loved Judy and wanted to protect her, but he was also financially dependent on her continued success. Watching her struggle with addiction, mental illness, and the pressures of fame took its toll on their relationship. By the late 1950s, their marriage was falling apart under the weight of all the forces that had been destroying Judy since childhood. CBS's offer for Judy to host her own weekly television variety shows seemed like the perfect opportunity for her to reach a new generation of fans while working in a medium that might be less physically demanding than movies or live performance. The Judy Garland Show was supposed to be her triumphant return to regular television, showcasing her incredible talent in front of millions of viewers every week. Instead, it became one of the most painful chapters in her already tragic story. From the beginning, the show was plagued by the same problems that had haunted Judy throughout her career: studio interference, creative conflicts, and her ongoing struggles with addiction and mental health. CBS executives wanted a traditional variety show that would appeal to mainstream audiences, while Judy and her creative team envisioned something more intimate and personal. The resulting compromise satisfied no one and showcased the worst aspects of television production. Judy's condition during the filming of the show was heartbreaking to witness. Some days she would arrive on set energetic and brilliant, delivering performances that reminded everyone why she was considered one of the greatest entertainers of all time. Other days, she would be barely functional, struggling with the effects of medication and the depression that had plagued her for years. The inconsistency made it impossible to maintain the quality that television demanded. The show's guest stars, including many of Judy's longtime friends and collaborators, watched with growing alarm as she deteriorated before their eyes. Mickey Rooney, who had known her since they were teenagers at MGM, was shocked by how frail and vulnerable she appeared. But even in her weakened state, there were moments when the old Judy would shine through moments of pure talent and charisma. That reminded everyone of what the world was losing. After just one season, the Judy Garland Show was canceled, marking the end of Judy's mainstream television career and her last real opportunity for steady high-profile work. At 41, she was considered unemployable by the major networks and studios, her reputation for unreliability preceding her wherever she tried to work. The girl who had once been Hollywood's most bankable star was now seen as too much of a risk for any major entertainment company to take on. When Judy left America for London in 1964, it felt like both an escape and an exile. The entertainment industry that had created her had now rejected her, leaving her with few options but to seek work wherever she could find it. London's cabaret scene and smaller venues offered her a chance to perform, but they also represented a dramatic comedown from the grand stages and movie sets, where she had once reigned supreme. The performances during this period were both magnificent and heartbreaking. On her good nights, Judy could still command an audience like few performers ever had, her voice carrying all the emotional weight of her experiences. But the good nights were becoming increasingly rare, outnumbered by performances where she struggled to remember lyrics, arrived late, or sometimes didn't show up at all. Audiences never knew which Judy Garland they would see. Her marriage to Mark Heron in 1965 was another attempt to find stability in love, but it was doomed from the start. Heron was a struggling actor who was more interested in Judy's connections than in providing the support she desperately needed. The marriage lasted less than a year, adding another failure to Judy's growing list of romantic disappointments. Each broken relationship took more of her spirit, leaving her more isolated and vulnerable. Mickey Deans, whom Judy married in March 1969, just months before her death, represented her final hope for happiness. He was younger than her, energetic, and seemed genuinely devoted to helping her rebuild her life and career. But by then, the damage was too extensive for love alone to repair. Judy's body was failing from years of drug abuse, her career was in ruins, and her mental state was increasingly fragile. The last few months of Judy's life were a tragic mixture of hope and desperation. She was trying to get clean, trying to rebuild her relationships with her children, trying to find some peace after decades of chaos. But the entertainment industry had taken too much from her, starting when she was just a child. The little girl who had dreamed of singing over the rainbow was finally ready to let go of the yellow brick road. But she was too broken to find her way home. The morning of June 22, 1969, dawned gray and quiet in London, giving no indication that the world was about to lose one of its most beloved voices. Judy Garland was found dead in the bathroom of her Belgravia home by Mickey Deans, her fifth husband, who had been married to her for just 3 months. She was 47 years old, and the official cause of death was ruled an accidental overdose of barbiturates. But those who knew her understood that Judy had been dying slowly for years. This was simply the moment when her battered body and spirit could fight no longer. The news of Judy's death sent shockwaves around the world. Radio stations immediately began playing her songs, with Over the Rainbow heard constantly on airwaves from New York to Tokyo. Fans gathered outside theaters where she had performed, leaving flowers and singing the songs that had meant so much to them. The girl who had made millions believe in the possibility of finding happiness. Somewhere over the rainbow had finally escaped her own tormented rainbow. But not to the magical land of Oz she had sung about, instead, to whatever peace death might offer. Little did the mourning world know just how alone Judy had been in her final months. The entertainment industry that had profited from her talent for decades was conspicuously absent during her struggles. Former colleagues who had worked with her during her peak years were busy with their own careers, and the studio executives who had controlled her life were retired or dead. She died with debts of over $4 million, despite having earned millions throughout her career. Another victim of the financial exploitation that plagued so many stars of her generation. Funeral arrangements revealed the tragic state of Judy's final years. There was no money for a proper burial, and it was only through the kindness of friends and fans that she was given a funeral worthy of her stature. James Mason delivered a eulogy that captured the paradox of Judy's life. The little girl whom the world loved was the one person who never experienced the love she gave so freely to others. In death, Judy Garland became more than just an entertainer. She became a symbol of the price of fame and the dangers of an industry that consumes its stars. Her passing marked the end of Hollywood's golden age, a time when studios had absolute power over their contracted players. The world began to understand that the magic they had witnessed on screen had been created through a system that was fundamentally cruel and exploitative. In the decades following Judy Garland's death, her story became a cautionary tale that fundamentally changed how the entertainment industry treats its young performers. The horrific details of her childhood exploitation, the studio-sanctioned drug addiction, and the systematic destruction of her personal life shocked a world that was beginning to understand the dark side of Hollywood glamour. Judy's tragedy became the catalyst for reforms that would protect future generations of child stars from the same fate. The child labor laws in California were strengthened partly in response to what had happened to Judy and other young performers of her era. The Coogan Law, originally passed to protect child actors' earnings, was expanded and reinforced. Tutoring requirements were made more stringent. Working hours were limited more strictly, and greater oversight was established to prevent the kind of exploitation that had destroyed Judy's childhood and ultimately her life. But Judy's most lasting legacy wasn't legislative, was cultural. Her authentic, emotionally raw performances had shown the world that entertainment could be more than just escapism. It could be a profound expression of human experience. The vulnerability she displayed, often unintentionally, paved the way for a new generation of performers who could be honest about their struggles and imperfections. Artists like Barbra Streisand, Liza Minnelli, and countless others built careers on the foundation of authenticity that Judy had established, often at great personal cost. The LGBTQ+ community adopted Judy as an icon, recognizing in her story their own experiences of being different, misunderstood, and often rejected by mainstream society. Her song Over the Rainbow became an unofficial anthem for anyone who dreamed of a world where they could be accepted for who they truly were. The Stonewall riots occurred just days before the first anniversary of her death. and many historians note that Judy's funeral had brought together the LGBTQ community in a way that helped galvanize the movement for equal rights. Today, when we hear Over the Rainbow, we understand it as more than just a song from a children's movie. It's the voice of every person who has ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control, who has ever dreamed of escape to a better world. Judy Garland's tragic life and early death ensured that her voice